Welcome to a new season of Life with Liliana and Friends. Can you believe that we are in season 5 already? And last season ended a bit abruptly. We do apologize for that, but I hope that you watched all of the previous episodes that we were putting up. We have so many new followers. Welcome to those of you who have recently joined, and I hope you've used the opportunity while we weren't doing any new shows to catch up on what we've already done. So there's been so much happening. I hope that you are also all following the behind the scenes page, which is Liliana Warid. If you're not, please find it and follow it, because you will see a lot of spaces that we've been in, a lot of things that we've been doing. And this platform, we get to bring to the surface a lot of the stories and lessons that we're learning along the way. So as you know, this platform is intended to equip people, to equip us with some tools, with information to help us thrive in life, okay? And there's so many things that get in the way of us thriving. Last season we looked at a few things. We looked at, and remember, we pick topics that we don't always talk about. So my dear friend Melania shared her experience of being raped as a young child by the father of her friend at a sleepover. And you can imagine what that does to a young child, right? So again, remember, the theme of that season was, what are some things that get in the way of people thriving? So of course that impacted her, and there's so many other young people who go through the same thing. We also spoke to Letitia, who spoke about pornography and the impact that's having on our young people and older adults as well. We also understood a bit better how that has been influencing the rape, numbers of rape and things like that in our country. So she presented some great stats on that. We also spoke to my husband Edwin, and he grew up in the barracks in Lotoka, and he spoke about how the people who were around him, or the people that he chose to spend his time with, influenced him to think very differently about the choices that he made. And then we finished off with Philly. Philly was great because Philly Vosorongo, who's a lawyer, has been in many cases where he's had to represent young people in court, or he's seen cases of them where the young people their lives just change because of some time that they spent in jail, or some wrong decisions, some poor decisions that they've made while they were younger. And he also shared some important points on things that we need to be aware of that are actually criminal, that we might not know. But what I also love about Philly, and it was a great way to end that season, is he talked about his role as a father and how important it was, or it is, for us as parents to guide our children, to shepherd them through these times. And the spaces that we're in at the moment, what I've seen is every single story points right back to the home. And I know this is a very popular opinion as well. How are we doing as parents? What are we teaching our children? How are we getting alongside them? How are we equipping them with tools? And I love that has come up as a root cause in a way, because it shows us that we have a lot more control. We don't have to get so distressed if we don't like the leaders in the country or in your workplace or whatever, because we have a lot of control as parents, as guardians in our own home. So this season, we're going to be focusing on the topic trauma. And the reason why we're going to do that is because, again, thinking about the root causes of a lot of the social issues we've been seeing, we've been experiencing in the community as we've been moving around, is trauma or unresolved trauma. All of us, whether you're in you feel like you're in a marginalized community, or you feel like your life couldn't be any better, I am 100% sure we've all experienced some kind of trauma in our lives. And we often disregard the fact that trauma needs to be dealt with, no matter how small. So I've invited a very important guest today to join us. This is her second time on the show. Her name is Mbolo Arieta Melania Loma Langitora, and she is my favorite daughter. Welcome to the show, Nini, again.
Thank you for having me, Mom.
Do you love your name?
Yes.
Yes.
I love my name.
Right answer, because I love your name too. These are one of the few times that I get to say her whole name and she can't really shout at me because we're on camera, right? Thank you for joining us again, Lubengo.
Thank you for having me. Love being on the show with you.
So she is, for those who don't know, Melania is doing her postgrad in psychology. She has, last year she completed a degree in Bachelor of Arts, majoring in psychology from Deakin University, and she has graduated with distinction. I like to say that all the time on air, just because I'm so proud of this brilliant young woman. She's going to go on to do her master's, because she's explained to me that in order to be a licensed psychologist, you need to get your master's, yes. Right? So she's on that journey. Now, the reason why I've asked Melania to come and speak to us about trauma is because, first of all, it's something that she's quite passionate about. She's already spoken about this in a few different places. We've had some psychoeducation sessions with a group of counselors at the Safe House for Sex Workers, and she was part of that as well. And then also at church or in our Christian setting. And recently, like get this, recently, like just last week, this is like the mom brag moment, eh? Just leave it, Lubengo. Okay. Recently, she spoke to a group of cancer survivors and also some patients too, and talking about trauma. So you can imagine how important and how life-giving. I was there, I heard it. It was life-giving even for me. So I think I've talked, I'm almost going to say the whole speech on trauma now, because I've heard it and I think it's going to be really useful. So can we start here, Lubengo? Can we start from the definition of trauma? Please give us a very simple definition. What is trauma?
Right. So trauma is how we respond emotionally to really bad things that happen to us. Okay. And I think for a long time we've thought of trauma as in the form of PTSD, where like someone goes through something.
So can you just explain PTSD?
Oh yeah, PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and it usually affects soldiers coming back from war, or people that have been through really bad accidents or lived through really bad natural disasters.
Yes.
And so the definition of trauma was exclusive for a really long time, but as we slowly unpack it, it seems that it's a lot more common than we had thought. And so trauma can be a number of experiences, and some examples of that could be any form of abuse. So it could be sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal, emotional abuse. It could also be the loss of a loved one, right, which is really common. It could also be the breaking apart of a family when your parents get divorced. That's really traumatic. And so it really covers a lot of experiences that we have. Trauma doesn't have to be an event that you experience firsthand. So it can also be watching someone go through something horrible, like seeing your parent being abused, is a really traumatic experience. And it is also subjective, which means that what can be considered traumatic to one person isn't exactly traumatic to another person. So yeah, that's what trauma is.
There's a couple of things just before we move on. So if you could just touch on PTSD again. Yeah. So what might, like if we use a simple example, like an easy example of a soldier coming back from war, what are some things that might indicate that they have post-traumatic stress disorder, for example?
Right, so with disorders, the main thing that sets it apart from normal behavior or regular anxiety, like just having anxiety day to day, is that it affects their ability to function on a daily basis. Okay. So they find it really hard to do things that that people usually have no trouble doing, that we're just meant to be able to function in. There are a lot of triggers in the environment that turn into episodes, which means that they just have an overflow of emotions, and it's really hard. They basically just shut down, and that's the main I think that's the main difference.
So sometimes like a loud sound, if they were in a place where there were bombs or, stuff like that. That's what I saw in the movies.
Sounds, smells, yes, thank you.
In the movies, do it really well, eh? Like a loud sound, and then suddenly this grown man is like cowering in the corner. That is, so what it impacts, so that's a good point. So the difference between PTSD and anxiety is that PTSD gets in the way of you living your everyday life. Because a lot of us experience anxiety also, but then we can continue doing the day-to-day things and maybe it just weighs on us.
Yeah, and a lot of people think that anxiety is an indicator of like, it's a bad thing, but anxiety can be healthy. Like everyone has experiences anxiety before we go up and speak in front of someone or before a big test. So it's normal to have anxiety. It's just knowing when that crosses the line, when it's too much, to the point where it affects your ability to function.
Right. And the last thing I wanted to just touch on is you talked about it being subjective. And I like that you brought that up because I've seen many times, and even in my own story, it's kind of something that really bothers you and then you tell somebody and they're like, Sichi, that's nothing. That's what you mean, right?
Exactly. And the thing with trauma is that it overwhelms you. It's an event that overwhelms you, right? To the point where the very foundation of who you are is compromised. So a lot of people have that foundation taken away from them, and that's what makes things traumatic. If you have people around you, and if after you've experienced that traumatic event, you're counseled and you're sorry, I lost my train.
That's okay.
If you have people around you and they make you feel safe after that traumatic event, then it won't affect you as much as if you had no one around you and you were completely lost and out of control, not out of control, and you've lost control of the situation.
Right. So that's so interesting. I feel like we're moving so fast and my brain is still marinating. Well, don't be sorry, but how can we identify? So how will we know if we've experienced some trauma? Right.
So there are a bunch of indicators that you're dealing with unresolved trauma. And I'm going to mention 3, but I'm sure there are a lot more pointers. The first one is that you constantly have flashbacks of that moment, and I'm not talking about like a happy experience and you look back on like good memories. I'm talking about when you constantly relive the worst experiences of your life, and it's an intrusive thought, so you have no control over whether you think about it or not. So if you're just, it usually happens in idle time, or like when you're just sitting around and you're constantly replaying that in your mind. That's when you know that that you're dealing with it. And in this stage, a lot of people get caught up with substance abuse because we want to be able to forget that really traumatic memory or that traumatic event. And so we use that to kind of numb our senses. But as we talked about in the last episode, after that high wears off, you're left with that same trauma and that same memory. So you haven't really been dealing with it. So the flashbacks are one way in which you can realize, okay, what is being flashback that must have been or can be categorized as a traumatic experience because you're reliving and it's intrusive. It comes when you don't want it. It's like you're trying to block it out and it comes. And then we go and drink sometimes, or there's some kind of substance abuse sometimes. So what else? You said there were 3. Yes. So the second thing is that, like I mentioned before, it affects our ability to function on a daily basis. So a lot of things that that people are usually able to do, people that are living with trauma find it really difficult to do. It could be just going out places, it could be hearing a certain sound or smelling a certain smell, whatever reminds them or whatever triggers that memory of that traumatic experience. The third thing is that we tend to isolate ourselves. There is such a thing as community-based trauma, where like a bunch of people share the same traumatic experience, especially with like natural disasters. But in this case, when you're dealing with trauma on a personal level, we usually think that no one will be able to understand what we're going through, and so we tend to isolate ourselves, or we find it hard to keep or maintain relationships.
I see. And can I just ask about isolating yourself? Would it be right to say that sometimes we isolate ourselves mentally, like in our head? You know, because I've seen sometimes people, for example, who commit suicide, and we go back over the stories and try and figure out how we could have identified, and a lot of the time then they don't isolate themselves physically,
Yes.
but they're always with people. But I reckon it's true that you can be with people but still be isolated. Is that right?
100%. We always have, when we go through a traumatic experience, we always want to protect ourselves. We always have that wall up to be able to protect ourselves, and our body is always on alert, our mind is always on alert to try and protect ourselves from things that could lead to other negative experiences.
Yes, because you can be with people and still feel so alone. Because like you just mentioned, you feel like I've been through this and no one can understand it. That is so sad, Nia.
Oh, it is.
Man, I feel like giving you a hug, but I don't know what it's got to do with you. But anyway, I want to give someone a hug. Before we move on from these indicators, something I wanted to just bring up was depression. So when you said your second point was trauma affects your ability to do the everyday normal things. Now, I've seen or heard a lot of people who suffer from depression just not able to get out of bed and things like that. So how is depression related to trauma? Like, what is the connection?
So trauma is actually a factor for the development of a lot of disorders, not just depression.
Okay.
It can be like, in psychology we have criteria, right? So what we use to diagnose the person that we are dealing with, and a lot of the criteria has to do with trauma. So it's not only that; it could also be GAD, which is general anxiety disorder. Actually, no, that's wrong. Sorry, can we cut that out?
Okay, that's wrong.
With major depressive disorder.
Okay,
for sure.
Okay.
And a bunch of phobias start from trauma. So it's very much the foundation of a lot of disorders.
Oh, okay. I'm sure that people who go through depression, is it possible to go through depression and just not know why?
Yes, that's the case for like almost everyone.
Sorry, that's a silly question to a psychologist.
That's okay, but thank you for asking that, because a lot of people don't understand how our experiences and our trauma affect what we're going through right now, because trauma usually happens so back in the past. It happens like a long time before we actually are diagnosed with a disorder. We think that it has nothing to do with one another.
Right.
But it is definitely the starting point for a lot of disorders.
Right.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. I really hope that helps somebody, because I've heard that word depression a lot, in many, many different conversations. So we're actually going to do this conversation in 2 parts, because I want to talk about the healing, but I feel like we should give that some time. So I just wanted to ask you one more thing before we wrap up this, and then we'll continue next week in the second half of this. I wanted to ask why it's important to address trauma directly. Like, wouldn't, we always say time's a healer. Doesn't it just go away over time?
Right.
Especially when it happens as kids, because so much trauma happens as kids.
So a lot of people think that that time is a healer, and it may be in some cases, especially when we're constantly being exposed to things or to an environment that includes elements of that trauma.
Right.
So for example, if we have if trauma had to do with an experience with alcohol, if we're continuously exposed to events or situations that include alcohol, then slowly we'll start to heal from that. So it's very it can be a healer in that sense.
Okay,
but it's not exactly the time, but the continuous exposure to things that remind us of that.
That's interesting. So remember, this is like Joey. Sorry, Joey, we're just going to use your example without your permission here. But anyway, like to do with a C.
Right.
Right. And I remember when we were talking about it, Joey won't mind. Yeah, Joey's... Joey. But anyway, like there was issues with being in the water again. But I remember you saying something about one of the ways to heal is exposure in a controlled environment.
Yes.
So when Joey and I started paddling together, and that was, you know, he was safe, he had a life jacket, he had a lot of support if anything happened. But that was very intentional, eh? So would it be right to say that you'd go into those spaces intentionally to heal? Like, not you have the issue with alcohol and then you just put yourself in there thinking, because then you might get more
And the important thing with Joey is that he eased himself into that situation. He didn't throw himself into the ocean without any protection to try and get over that trauma. He slowly went into the canoe and then slowly started to get used to the ocean again. So that's the important part that we need to know, especially when treating trauma.
Yes.
Yeah, and as you said, like, why we should be able to deal with it directly, like I said, it's the foundation for a lot of things that may happen to us right now. So we think that what we experience now and how we live now is completely separate from what we had experienced, but it affects our ability to maintain and be in relationship with people, which is a huge part of our lives. It also affects our ability to function, and it has a huge range of physical implications and effects, which a lot of people don't understand. It can be a contributing factor to a number of illnesses, physical illnesses, I mean. So
that's interesting.
It really affects our quality of life.
It does, doesn't it? So you often talk about, you liken it to an injury. Do you want to just use that? Because I think that's a great analogy.
So trauma in the medical sense, the medical definition of trauma is a serious injury. And when we have, I think it's really important to be able to think of mental trauma in the same way, because when we get a physical serious injury, we go to seek professional help, because if we leave it, it won't just go away. It's not like a small cut or a scratch that will just heal over time. If you leave a serious injury untreated, it continues to fester inside your body and it spreads throughout your entire body. So the thing with trauma is that it continues to eat away at every part of your life, the same way a serious injury does. And so that's why it's really important.
Yes, and that manifests, I guess, in our behavior, in how we navigate relationships.
Because the thing with mental trauma is that no one can see it. It's not like a super obvious broken leg or broken arm. And so all that people are observing, all that people are seeing is your behavior. And a lot of the time, the behavior of those who have trauma is not pleasant, because we always have our guard up. We're always looking for, you know, what's going to hurt us. And we also, like, we tend to pass on that hurt and that, what we have felt to other people, and that's just not fair.
Hurt people hurt people.
Yes, that's true.
Man, this has been so useful. You've given us so much to think about. Thank you for today. We're just going to continue into the next episode, where we're going to talk about healing after this. But for those of you who have been watching this evening, I hope that was really useful to you guys as well. And we're going to, because there's so much information, I want to encourage you to, you know, not only share this, but maybe watch it again and think about your own situation. Because something interesting Melania said is that trauma can be directly, you know, done directly to you, and it can also be secondary. You may have watched a parent or sibling or a friend get abused, you know, whether it was a physical or emotional or verbal or whatever. And the more Melania talks about this, the more I realize all of us have some kind of trauma. The key thing that I wanted to just make sure we remember today is there are three things that Melania said that are indicators. So remember, she also mentioned there's a difference between anxiety and trauma. And so the three indicators, one was that you get flashbacks, and, you know, flashbacks of things that, of a time or series of things that happened that are not pleasant, that you really don't want to think about, right? And they are very intrusive. They just come at you without you calling it up. That's an important one. It will also, with trauma, affects your ability to function. Sometimes you might be sitting and working, and then you're kind of like staring out into the atmosphere, or you don't even want to work sometimes, and that's when we start talking about depression, don't want to get out of bed. So trauma, Melania was talking about how trauma does influence, is one of the factors that leads to depression. And lastly, you tend to isolate. And we talked about an important thing. Isolation doesn't just mean not physical isolation, because you can be with many people and still feel all alone. So next week we're going to go into healing. So how do we address this? So I hope that you enjoyed this. Please use the next few days to just marinate, have the information, have some conversations, and please think about yourself, because we are going to be right back talking about ways that you can start your healing. Thank you very much for your time. We will see you back here, same time, same place next week. Vinaka.